In the mountains of Colorado, where snow-capped peaks touch the clouds, there lies a hill called Cedar Ridge, a place that once sent out a signal to save lives during the Great Storm of 1972. Many years later, a man carrying deep wounds in his heart returns to that small town with his loyal shepherd dog named Ranger. He only wishes to sell his father's old land and leave forever. But God has other plans. A letter buried beneath the porch, a mysterious radio signal echoing through a blizzard, and a journey of redemption begins, not only to save his son, but to reclaim his own soul. Snow drifted across the high ridge like pale smoke, wrapping the quiet town of Cedar Ridge in winter silence. The pine trees leaned under the weight of frost, and the lake below mirrored a gray sky that had forgotten warmth. Down the dirt road came Jack Morrison, shoulders heavy beneath a worn navy coat, his breath fogging in the mountain air. His hair was streaked with silver, his face weathered and marked by years of sea winds and sleepless nights. Beside him padded Ranger, a 5-year-old German shepherd with thick gray-white fur and alert amber eyes. The dog walked close, glancing up often as if to remind his master to keep breathing. For 10 years, Ranger had been the only witness to Jack's silence. Jack stopped at the gate of his father's old house, once white, now a skeleton of peeling paint and creaking boards. The American flag above the porch was faded, torn by time. His throat tightened as he looked at the porch swing where he had once taught a small boy to whistle through his teeth. That boy, Ben, was now a stranger. The wind carried the scent of rust, pine, and something almost sacred. The memory of his father's radio tower on the hill where voices once broke through the storms. Jack whispered, "I'm home, Dad," but the house only answered with the groan of wood and the distant cry of a crow. The door opened, and Linda Carter, his late father's sister, appeared. She was tall, thin, wrapped in a gray cardigan that hung from her shoulders like an old curtain. Deep lines framed her mouth. Her eyes were sharp with both wisdom and fatigue. Life had turned her stern. Years of raising a boy not her own and keeping the lights on had hardened the gentleness she once had. "You look older," she said flatly. "He's upstairs. Don't expect him to run into your arms." Her voice wasn't cruel, but there was no warmth in it. Ranger wagged his tail once. Linda almost smiled, the first crack in her armor, before she turned away. Jack stepped inside, the floorboards complaining under boots that hadn't walked home in a decade. Upstairs, Ben Morrison stood by a frost-fogged window. 14 now, tall for his age but narrow, with dark hair that curled over his brow and a defiant set to his jaw. He looked older than a boy should. 10 years without a father had taught him to fix the roof, stack wood, and build walls around his heart. When he heard the footsteps, he didn't turn. "You finally came back," he said, voice steady but trembling underneath. Jack stopped in the doorway. "I wanted to come sooner." Ben turned then, eyes cold. "You always want to, Dad. You just never do." Ranger whimpered softly, breaking the silence. The boy's eyes flicked down to the dog, curious but unmoved. "At least someone stayed with you," he muttered. Jack wanted to tell him everything about the nightmares, the noise, the guilt that followed him across oceans. But the words wouldn't come. He took a step closer. "I came back to stay," he said quietly. Ben looked away, jaw tight. "Then fix what you left." The morning after the snow stopped, sunlight finally spilled over Cedar Ridge, painting the pines in pale gold. Jack Morrison stood on the porch, a hammer in his hand, repairing the broken steps just as Ben had demanded. Each strike of the nail echoed like a quiet apology. Ranger sat nearby, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. The air smelled of sap and melting frost, and for the first time in years, Jack felt the fragile pulse of belonging, until he saw the envelope taped to the door. Notice of property tax delinquency. His stomach tightened. Debt was already following him home. Selling the land might be the only way to start over. That afternoon, while Jack sorted through the shed for tools, Ranger began scratching at the old porch floorboards, his claws clicking against something metallic. "Hey, leave it," Jack muttered, but the dog kept digging until a rusted tin box surfaced, caked with dirt and years of silence. Jack pried it open carefully. Inside was a folded letter wrapped in wax paper, its edges yellowed. The handwriting was unmistakable, his father's bold, careful print. As he read, his throat closed. "If you find this, son, it means I'm gone. Remember the ridge, the tower. It still has a heart. Keep it alive when you can." Beneath the words lay a small brass key and a photograph of the old radio tower standing against a storm, lightning crawling behind it like veins of fire. Jack's fingers trembled. The tower had been abandoned since before Ben was born. Yet something in the letter felt alive, as if the old man were still speaking through static. Later, Jack took a walk through town. Cedar Ridge hadn't changed much. Wooden storefronts, a diner with a flickering neon sign, and the smell of coffee and diesel hanging in the thin air. At the post office window, he met Grace Williams, the town school teacher. Grace was in her late 30s, medium height, with auburn hair pulled into a loose braid, freckles scattered across sun-warmed skin. Her voice was soft but firm, shaped by years of calming, restless students. She had once been the girl Jack left behind, a memory he'd carried longer than he should. Grace looked up, surprised, then smiled faintly. "Jack Morrison, 10 years, and you still know how to disappear." Jack forced a smile. "Guess I'm not as good at staying." She studied him, her green eyes thoughtful, then changed the subject. "We're holding a meeting tonight about saving the ridge. Developers want to blast the north face for granite." The words hit him harder than he expected. Cedar Ridge, the place in his father's letter. That evening, Jack climbed the hill behind the house. The wind was sharp, the forest hushed but watchful. Ranger trotted ahead, nose twitching as if following something unseen. From the summit, Jack saw the tower, a thin, rusted skeleton, the sky darkened by late afternoon, the clouds hanging low like bruises over Cedar Ridge. The air felt heavy, full of snow, yet to fall. Jack returned from the ridge with his mind crowded by his father's letter. He wanted to tell Ben about it, about the tower, the key, the promise. But when he stepped inside, the boy sat at the table with his arms crossed and anger already waiting. "You joined them, didn't you?" Ben snapped, his voice cracked between youth and fury. Jack frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Grace told everyone you took a job with the quarry company," Ben said. "You're helping them blow up the ridge. Grandpa spent his life saving that hill, and now you're selling it." His face was red, his eyes glistening with tears he refused to let fall. Jack's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to keep us afloat, Ben. The house, the taxes." "Grandpa never gave up," Ben shouted. "He believed in something bigger than money." Ranger stirred, ears back, sensing the storm brewing inside the house before the one outside even began. Jack turned away, his throat tight. The truth was ugly. He had taken the job just for a week, hoping to gather enough to stop the debt collectors. He didn't expect his son to see only betrayal. "You don't know what it's like to fight and lose everything," Jack muttered. "No," Ben said coldly, grabbing his coat. "But I know what it's like to lose a father." He stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled the glass. The first flakes began to fall, slow and deliberate, like the world holding its breath. Jack shouted his name once, twice, then silence swallowed the road. He grabbed his coat and flashlight, heart hammering. Ranger barked, tail rigid, then bolted into the snow, already tracking the boy's scent. By the time Jack reached the edge of the woods, the blizzard had arrived in full force. The trees groaned under wind, branches bending like old bones. Visibility fell to a few feet, and each step sank deep. "Ben!" he shouted, voice shredded by the wind. No answer. Ranger's dark shape darted ahead, nose to the ground, barking short, urgent notes that echoed through the white chaos. Jack stumbled after him, his flashlight flickering. Somewhere behind the roar of the storm, thunder rolled, a sharp crack followed by another sound, faint but distinct. Static. The radio in his truck, parked down the road, had switched on by itself. Through the hiss of interference came a voice, deep and familiar, breaking through like a ghost from the past. "If you can hear me, son, don't abandon those who still wait." Jack froze. It was his father's voice, the same tone he remembered as a child sitting beside the shortwave receiver. Lightning split the sky, lighting up the ridge for a heartbeat, and in that moment Jack saw Ranger circling near a fallen branch, barking wildly. He ran toward the sound, snow biting his face. There, night devoured the ridge, turning the world into a blur of white noise and shadow. Jack's flashlight beam cut through the blizzard like a trembling thread, each breath freezing in his beard. His coat was soaked, his hands numb, but he refused to stop. "Ben, answer me!" The wind swallowed his voice whole. Ranger's bark echoed faintly ahead, a desperate rhythm of warning and faith. Following it, Jack stumbled through knee-deep snow until a dark shape loomed in the swirling white. An old forest cabin, half buried beneath drifts. The roof had caved in on one side, and the doorway was blocked by a heavy slab of fallen snow. From inside came the faintest cry, his son's voice. "Hang on, Ben!" Jack roared, clawing at the snow. Ranger leapt ahead, using his powerful forelegs to dig, his nails tearing through the crusted ice. Snow flew in bursts, his breath ragged and steaming. Jack joined him, his hands bleeding from cold, until a narrow gap appeared at the bottom of the door. "Ben!" he shouted again, pressing his ear to the opening. A weak cough answered. "Dad, I can't—" The words were faint, broken by shivering. "You're gonna be all right," Jack whispered, forcing the door until it cracked open enough for Ranger to slip inside. The dog crawled through first, whining, his thick coat brushing the edges of the splintered wood. Inside, the air was dark and still. Ranger found Ben huddled in a corner, his small frame trembling, face pale under the flicker of Jack's dying flashlight. The boy's lips were blue. Ranger pressed his body against him, curling close, sharing his heat like a living blanket. Jack forced his way inside next, snow collapsing behind him, sealing the entrance. He coughed in the cold air, the realization sinking in. They were trapped. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around Ben, rubbing his arms, whispering words he wasn't sure were prayers or apologies. "Stay awake, buddy. You hear me? You stay awake." Ranger lifted his head once, eyes heavy, then lowered it again onto Ben's chest, his steady heartbeat the only warmth in the frozen dark. Time dissolved. Jack drifted between exhaustion and memory. His father's radio tower glowing in lightning, his promise to keep it alive. He wondered if that promise had kept them breathing this long. The night howled outside, shaking the walls, but inside, man, boy, and dog clung to a fragile circle of warmth that refused to die. When dawn finally broke, light seeped through the cracks in the cabin roof, a thin gold line against white. Jack stirred first, his limbs aching, his breath shallow. "Ben," he whispered. The boy moved slightly, his eyes fluttering open. "Dad." Ranger didn't move. His gray and white fur was crusted with frost, his breathing faint but steady. "Good boy," Jack said hoarsely, laying a hand on the dog's flank. Then, faintly through the storm's dying echo, came another sound. Distant engines and voices calling names. Jack staggered to the window, clearing the frost with his sleeve. Red parkas moved through the trees. Rescuers. Minutes later, the door burst open. Grace Williams stepped in first, her face red from cold, but her green eyes sharp with relief. She was wrapped in a heavy rescue parka, snow dusting her hair. "Jack," she gasped, dropping to her knees beside Ben. "We picked up a signal on 1470. Thought it was interference, but it led us here." Jack blinked. The tower? The hospital in Silver Pine Valley was small, only 2 floors, the smell of antiseptic and coffee blending in the hallways. But to Jack Morrison, it felt like a cathedral. Snow still fell outside, soft and endless, covering the ambulance lights in a ghostly haze. Jack sat by his son's bedside, his hands rough and trembling. Ben lay motionless beneath white sheets, his skin pale, lashes frosted from the night before. A soft beep marked the rhythm of his heart, fragile but steady. Ranger lay curled near the foot of the bed, his breathing shallow, chest rising and falling with visible effort. His once bright amber eyes were dull with exhaustion, but they never left Ben's face. Jack brushed a hand through the boy's hair, his voice low and broken. "You hear me, kiddo? You made it. You're home." The door opened quietly, and Grace Williams stepped inside. She had changed out of her rescue coat into a nurse's spare uniform, her auburn hair damp from melted snow, her cheeks flushed from lack of sleep. She carried a thermos in one hand, a clipboard in the other. "The doctor says Ben's going to be fine," she said softly. "Mild hypothermia, dehydration, but no frostbite." Jack exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and prayer. Grace hesitated, then added, "You should know how we found you. It wasn't luck." She pulled a small radio receiver from her bag, dented and mud-streaked. The team picked up a steady broadcast on frequency 1470. At first we thought it was interference, until we heard a voice. Jack looked up sharply. "A voice?" Grace nodded. It said, "If you can hear me, son, don't abandon those who still wait." Her eyes softened. "It was your father, Jack. The system on his old tower, it's still working. Lightning must have triggered the backup transmitter. He built it to power on automatically after a storm." Jack stared at her, disbelief flickering into awe. "He planned for this," he whispered, "even after he was gone." Grace smiled faintly. "Maybe he knew someday you'd need a little guidance home." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder before turning to leave. Jack sat in silence, his thoughts spinning through years of distance, his father's stubborn faith, the tower that never died, the son he'd almost lost. He looked at Ben, then at Ranger. The dog's breathing was shallow, a faint whine in his throat. Jack knelt beside him, one hand resting on the animal's side. "You did good, boy," he whispered, voice trembling. "You kept us alive." Ranger's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, his tail giving the faintest wag. For a long time, Jack stayed like that, one hand on his son's shoulder, the other on the loyal creature that had carried their hope through the storm. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it did, Cedar Ridge thawed like a long-held breath. The snow melted down the slopes, revealing brown earth and the faint green promise of new life. Jack Morrison stood at the base of the old radio tower, now nothing more than a rusted frame against the pale sky. His hands were rough, still bandaged from winter's scars, but his eyes were alive in a way they hadn't been in years. Ranger, thinner now but walking strong, paced beside him, sniffing the damp soil. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and fresh rain, and somewhere deep inside him, Jack felt a quiet certainty. It was time to rebuild what had once saved lives, including his own. By mid-morning, the hill was alive with people. Grace Williams arrived first, wearing a faded denim jacket and a red scarf that danced in the wind. Her auburn hair glinted under the sun, her face calm but purposeful. "We've got volunteers," she said, gesturing down the path where a group of locals carried paint cans, ladders, and toolboxes. Among them was Tom Bennett, a retired mechanic in his 60s with a thick gray beard, sun-spotted hands, and a booming laugh that carried across the ridge. Once known as the best radio repairman in town, Tom had lived alone since losing his wife to cancer 5 years earlier, a man hardened by grief but softened by the sight of others rebuilding hope. "Let's see if this old beauty can still sing," he said, slapping the tower's steel leg affectionately. Ben worked quietly near the base, tightening bolts and cleaning panels. He was taller now, his boyish defiance replaced by focus. The cold winter had melted something in him, too. Jack watched his son for a long moment, then joined him. "You doing all right?" he asked. Ben nodded without looking up. "Yeah, just trying to do this right." Jack smiled faintly. "You already are." Grace approached with coffee for both of them, her fingers brushing Jack's for just a heartbeat, a small gesture that carried years of unspoken history. Nearby, Ranger barked once at a flock of crows circling above, his voice strong again. As the sun climbed higher, the crew worked together, sanding rust, painting the tower a new coat of deep forest green, reconnecting cables, and installing a small modern transmitter that Tom had salvaged from his old workshop. The air buzzed with the sound of drills and laughter. Even Linda, Jack's stern aunt, appeared at noon with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, muttering that someone had to feed this circus. For the first time in years, Jack saw her smile, a small, weary smile, but real. By late afternoon, the tower stood tall again, gleaming in the fading light. When all was ready, Tom nodded. "Let's light her up." Jack climbed the narrow ladder to the control booth, Ben and Grace beside him. He flicked the switch. The old transmitter hummed, the dials flickering to life. Jack leaned toward the microphone, voice steady but full of emotion. "This is the morning of the ceremony broke clear and bright over Cedar Ridge. The last of the winter frost clung to the pine needles like silver dust, and sunlight spilled across the rebuilt tower, making its green steel shimmer. The entire town had gathered near the base, farmers in their Sunday coats, children wrapped in scarves, and elders holding transistor radios close to their chests. Jack Morrison stood before them, wearing his father's old Navy jacket, the brass buttons polished to a dull shine. His face, once worn by guilt and distance, now carried quiet pride. Beside him sat Ranger, his thick fur gleaming again, the faint scar on his leg barely visible. The dog's ears twitched every time someone spoke his name. At the front of the crowd, Mayor Douglas Hill, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with a trimmed beard and the calm voice of a born speaker, adjusted the microphone. He had once worked as a forest ranger before a back injury forced him behind a desk. But he still carried the air of a man used to wind and weather. "Folks," he began, "we've had our share of storms in this valley. Some you can see and some you can't. But when the radio came back alive that night, when we heard that old signal again, it reminded us that hope doesn't rust." He looked at Jack, then smiled. "And sometimes that hope barks." The crowd laughed softly as he motioned for Ranger to step forward. The mayor knelt, pinning a small silver badge to the dog's collar, engraved with the words, "Our family's guardian." Cameras clicked, and a hush fell when Ranger wagged his tail once, as if acknowledging the honor. Ben stood next to his father, taller now, and standing with quiet confidence. He wore a plaid shirt tucked neatly into his jeans, his hair trimmed short. His eyes no longer held anger, only pride. Grace Williams stood a few steps away, her auburn hair glowing in the morning light. She wore a cream-colored coat and held a small bouquet of mountain flowers she'd gathered at dawn. When their eyes met, she smiled, not the polite smile of old friends, but one of shared peace. As the sun climbed higher, light streamed through the cracked glass window of the transmission booth above the tower. It formed a faint cross of gold against the wall, a reflection born from imperfection. Jack looked up at it, his breath catching. "I've heard you, Dad," he whispered under his breath. Then he placed his hand on Ben's shoulder and guided him toward the microphone inside the booth. Grace joined them, Ranger lying near the doorway, resting but watchful. Jack adjusted the dials one last time and spoke into the mic, his voice calm but full of life. "This is Cedar Ridge Radio, frequency 1470. To anyone listening, if you can still hear us, it means you're still loved." The first notes of Amazing Grace floated through the speakers, soft and pure, echoing across the valley. Down below, the crowd began to. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles in thunder or lightning. He sends them through the quiet voices we still hear when the world goes silent. The story of Cedar Ridge reminds us that faith is not about seeing, but about trusting. That even in the coldest storms, His light still finds its way to us. Maybe your own signal is waiting too, in a memory, a prayer, or a loved one you've yet to forgive. Hold on to that, because when you choose hope, you choose God's grace. If this story touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. May God bless everyone watching, guide your hearts, and keep your families safe beneath His endless light.